Thank you, Tina. Thank you, everybody. So let me start by thanking GNHRE and UNEP for giving us this opportunity to have this discussion. I think the intersection of trade and environmental issues is certainly becoming more and more prominent now. And I guess that sort of underlies the whole discussion around sustainable development, climate change, and where we are going with it now. So just briefly to introduce, we've got three members of the panel. We've got Prof. Emma Ispet, we've got Sisewutami Maimele, and Dr. Regis Simo. Really an eminent panel that we have that have availed us and given us their time. So we're really, really excited to listen to them. So these are the three experts that we have today, and they will really engage with the questions around the issue of climate change and how do we go about addressing it. Just in brief terms, essentially, the idea behind sustainable development is the idea of trying to find a balance or integrate at least environmental protection and economic development, and of course the less heralded pillar of social upliftment. At least I know in South Africa we're still grappling with what that even means and whether that actually ever gets considered. But primarily in the front of the queue is the whole idea of how do we balance the two, economic development versus environmental protection. And I guess that's why we are here in terms of climate change. Some of us think are in summer, but it looks like, well, it's supposed to be spring apparently, but it feels like it's a mixture of summer and winter. And no one really understands what the weather is. And I suspect it's really the issue coming back to the integration between economic development and environmental protection. And recently, what we have seen, at least from the EU, for example, is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And America has got the Inflation Reduction Act, and all of them seek to address the issue of climate change. But part of the problem, so part of the emerging discussions around this issue is the idea that since the problem of climate change was supposed to be centered around the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, measures like the carbon border adjustment mechanism seem to shift the responsibility from, for example, the EU to the countries in the developing world that are now being told, listen, for you to be able to export your products to the EU, you need to show us that you've addressed your carbon emissions. And at least if you haven't, maybe, for example, imposed a tax or anything, then you have a comparable mechanism similar to the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So it now looks like the responsibility is now being directly shared between the countries that are responsible for climate change and the countries that would be regarded as not responsible for climate change. But that's part of the greater discussion also of factors like countries like South Africa, for example, are also now part of prominent in terms of climate change. We're probably the largest emitter, I think, in the continent, and probably now, I'm sure, we've entered the top 10 in terms of emitters because our economy is built on coal. So those are some of the emerging issues that are there. But many of the questions that really people have around this discussion is the issue of, is this really about climate change, or is this really about international trade? If you look at the Inflation Reduction Act in America, it seems like, in brackets, really it's about China, right? We need to shift the global supply chains of the electronic vehicles away from China to America. And so is it really about climate change? Are the mechanisms going to be really enforced, or is it about actually shifting global supply chains and friendshoring? The issue of decoupling of the world trade system. What is this really measure about? Or maybe does it even matter, really? If it's really about trade, but in the process they do address the climate change concerns, then maybe that's not a problem. But we don't know what is the correct answer. But that's why I've got the three experts. No one is here to listen to me. So I've got the three experts to interrogate these issues and any other issues that they think are relevant. So I've got three speakers that are going to be speaking to us. We've got Prof. Emma Ispet, who is in Australia, who's going to be speaking to us. And I will not preempt what she's going to say, but I'll leave it to Prof to speak to us and tell us what Prof wants to speak to us about. Then I've Mr. Sisewutami Maimele, who's here with me in South Africa, but he's in a better part of the country. He's in Pretoria. So he's also going to speak to us. And then, of course, we've got Dr. Simo, who is in Ireland, Northern.
We've lost Clive for a second. He was going to say that he is at Queen Mary University in Belfast in Ireland. Maybe I can just say welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. And Emma, if you wouldn't mind getting us started.
Sure. Thanks very much, Dina, and thanks, Clive. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here talking to you all today, and hopefully hearing some very interesting views and discussing later on. I am coming to you from Canberra, the capital of Australia, and Australia is, of course, a traditionally very fossil fuel dependent economy. So not unlike South Africa, for example. So we have had substantial political economy issues. Nonetheless, of course, Australia is a high income country. And so I think it's possible that some of my perspectives on this issue will be a little different to some of the others on the panel, but I think that's actually a really great thing, because I think we all need to talk together and share our different perspectives. But this perspective that I will try to bring is one of seeking opportunities. So as I mentioned, Australia is a traditionally very fossil fuel dependent economy. We are equal world's largest exporter of coal with Indonesia. We are around equal with Qatar, world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. And we're easily the world's largest exporter of iron ore, which of course has enormous consequential emissions. So all up, for example, about 9% of Asia's total emissions come from combining Australia's coal, gas, and iron ore. So one of the things that our team at the Australian National University have been working on for the last 5 years is not working on how to get rid of coal, but working on how to make use of Australia's potential, which is also very similar to a lot of the tropical countries, and particularly those of us with low rainfall, which is enormous renewable energy opportunity. And so I've had the pleasure for the last 5 years of being the Associate Director Research for the Australian National University's Zero Carbon Energy Initiative, which really has worked hard on understanding what the opportunities for Australia are, and how to stop being so scared of the energy transition. So our initiative includes 6 sort of projects. The one that I lead, as well as being Associate Director for the overall initiative, is the one on regulatory frameworks for trade and investment, which is why I'm hopefully well placed to talk to you today. We also have a project looking at domestic policies in other countries in the Asia Pacific, particularly countries like Indonesia, India, and Vietnam, looking at their policies for solar uptake, carbon pricing, offshore wind generation. Very importantly, and perhaps something that's a little of a similar issue for some people in the audience here, and very relevant, of course, to sustainable development, the most relevant from the Australian perspective, is Indigenous people's engagement with renewable energy developments. So in Australia, the Europeans basically forced Indigenous Australians off the land in the places that were quite easy to live, with the result that the places that are really sunny and hot and really windy are the places that have the highest concentration of Indigenous peoples and native title, so actual proper land title. Those happen to be, of course, the places that are fantastic for renewable energy development. And almost all of Australia's mega scale export-oriented renewable energy projects are in fact being proposed on traditionally owned lands. So a very important part of our project has been working on how can we really shift the paradigm for development on traditionally owned lands, which has not had a good history with the extractive industries, another parallel I expect between Australia and a lot of Africa, and try and actually make this an opportunity for genuine benefit sharing and sustainable development. We then have 3 projects, one about refined metals, as I mentioned, Australia's massive exports of iron ore, looking at can we combine our iron ore with our renewable energy, which happens to be in the same part of northwestern Australia, to actually start processing and value adding something which we haven't been doing for a couple of decades in this country. And same goes for aluminium and critical minerals, which of course Clive mentioned the politics and diversification strategies of major economies. Critical minerals are definitely central to a lot of those conversations. Of course, in terms of an alternative for fossil fuels, an actual fuel that you can put on ships as well as in pipes and send around the world, hydrogen and its derivatives are the leader. And so we have a lot of projects in Australia on that, and we have a project within our challenge on this. And last but not least, we have a project looking at renewable electricity systems. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of the context of not only what we work on, but the sorts of things that are occupying both research and policy communities in Australia, and indeed some of the foci of green industrial policy for Australia. So what I work on and what I have worked on for the last 20 years is essentially economic globalization and the environment, which these days is trade and climate in large part, and indeed trade-related climate policies, which are essentially the topic of today's session. So I've defined trade-related climate policies as policies that are nominally to support climate objectives, but which have substantive trade and or trade policy impacts. So as Clive said, it's sometimes hard to tell what these policies are really aimed at, but I'm going to call it a trade-related climate policy if at least that's what the government is claiming it's aiming at. So of course we have leading examples of this. The one that's first on everyone's list is carbon border adjustment mechanisms. The European Union, of course, is the most advanced in this regard. Japan, Canada, and the US, and now, as of last week, Australia are also considering one of these. And we'll get back to the political economy of that later on. Perhaps less understood, but an important element of trade-related climate policy are embedded emissions certification schemes, which might be sort of green or low emissions certification schemes. But these also relate to the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, because if you don't want to pay the levy that is assumed by, for example, the European Union, because you think your exports are cleaner than that, or a particular producer thinks their particular product is cleaner than that, you need to be able to prove that to someone. And so these certification schemes are important for that. And they're also important if you want to go out and market your green product to increasing numbers of savvy consumers around the world. On the plus side, there are things like preferential green good liberalization. The WTO has tried and failed for many decades to agree on a list of preferential green goods. But the Asia Pacific Economic Community have actually, since 2012, had a preferential liberalization list of environmental goods. And they've been looking in the last year or two at whether to expand that to include things like green hydrogen and the technologies used to produce that. And finally, we have more traditional things like linked emissions trading schemes. So what are the drivers of trade-related climate policy? There are, of course, a whole lot of, as we said, geopolitical and political drivers, that may not have anything to do with climate policy. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that if we're getting to net zero by mid-century and thereby trying to avoid all going up in a cloud of smoke or drowning like in the horrendous tragedy in Libya this week, we need to do something about emissions, and 22% of global emissions are embedded in traded products. So we cannot any longer just carve trade out, as we have for so many decades, and say that's a too hard problem, we'll deal with it later. We need some forms of trade-related climate policy, whether we like it or not, if we're going to avoid absolutely catastrophic climate change. So I think what we as a global community need to think about is how do we do that in an efficient and fair way without throwing away decades of hard work to get a rules-based global trading system. I think it's also important to emphasize with, for example, carbon border adjustment mechanisms. I can tell you exactly what has gone on in Australia, and it's the same story as happened in the EU. The CBAM isn't really because anyone thinks there's any leakage that we're discussing. The CBAM is because as soon as you try and strengthen your climate policy, which Australia has been very late to that party, and only in the last year or so actually sort of even started talking seriously about some binding climate policy. As soon as the government did that, industry, of course, started lobbying hard. And the fact that the government, in my view, the fact that the government is saying it's doing a review of whether we should consider a carbon border adjustment mechanism is essentially to appease that domestic industry in order to enable stronger climate policy domestically. Okay, so although it can feel like it's really an affront on you as an exporter, I think it's important to understand that these are really about enabling, from a political feasibility perspective, stricter climate policies in those Annex 1 countries. So I think it's important not to over-characterize this as being about pushing responsibility onto other countries. It's about politically enabling stricter climate policies in those higher income countries. And of course, it's painted as leakage concerns, and there is some reason to actually have genuine leakage concerns, not for the traditional reasons, but all of a sudden, if you think about hydrogen as an energy carrier, all of a sudden we have this massive potential that you never had before with fossil fuels, because with fossil fuels, the carbon emissions occurred where the energy was consumed. When it comes to hydrogen, if you're making it not from renewable energy, but from fossil fuels, the carbon emissions happen where it's produced, not where it's consumed. And this actually means there's a whole new sort of scale of leakage that could occur if, for example, we don't address the embedded carbon in things like hydrogen and derivatives. So this slide will probably not make anyone feel particularly happy, but you should if you care about the climate, meanwhile feeling concerned about the implications for the trade regime. So I've been lucky enough for the last year and a half to be working with the Trade and Integration Research team at the World Bank. And we have been collating a database of trade-related climate policies for G20 economies since 1990 till the start of this year. And what you can see, this graph plots the number of active climate policies across the G20 countries on average as a ratio of the number of active policies that they had in 2005. And what you can see here is this remarkable exponential growth curve. So if it feels like there's this exponential increase in policies that you need to understand and respond to, you're right, there literally is. And so this, of course, is a real burden for policymakers all around the world, but particularly for policymakers in countries that have limited bureaucratic resources. It's very hard to understand how to respond to all of these policies. I think it's also very important to understand that not all trade-related climate policies are equal in many senses. There are big differences between things like carbon border adjustment mechanisms and carbon pricing sticks, which tend to raise the cost of the net zero transition, and green industrial policy, or subsidies, or carrots as they're sometimes called, which tend to actually lower the cost of the energy transition. And this is an important distinction to bear in mind if you think about contrasting something like the Inflation Reduction Act with a carbon border adjustment mechanism. Both may be similar in terms of their trade diversion impacts, but they're very different in terms of their energy transition impacts. Another very much closely aligned to that issue of carbon border adjustment mechanisms and the issue of capturing trade is that climate policy for many decades, because it was trying to stay away from trade, was targeting processes that were happening within the domestic industry. So a certain facility might have been allowed to emit a certain amount of emissions. What we're seeing now is a switch to policies which are focused on products, on certifying products, on charging a carbon border adjustment mechanism based on the embedded emissions in a product. And so this is a sort of quite a big change from the perspective of regulators, and it has implications for the way that we think about carbon accounting. So I'm sure this is only a very short list of some of the concerns that we might have about these trade-related climate policies. Obviously, imposition of carbon pricing, if you feel your economy is not ready for that carbon pricing, can be a very big threat to economies. Unfair competition from green subsidies that larger economies may be able to afford that you don't feel like you are able to afford. And that's very much true in Australia as well. There's a big debate here because we also, as a relatively small economy, cannot match the Inflation Reduction Act. So there's a lot of hair being pulled out in Australia over this as well. And perhaps something that receives a little less attention, but I think deserves more attention, is the non-tariff barriers to trade issue. Because you know, economic theory tells us that actually, you know, carbon border adjustment mechanisms might be a valid globally welfare enhancing policy. However, if responding to those and proving the emissions embedded in your product is a massive regulatory burden, then that non-tariff barrier that arises could actually be a lot more problematic than the tax itself. So I know we don't have very much time. I'm going to throw out a few possible recommendations. I hope my other panelists will have other recommendations as well, and we'll get to them in the discussion. As I warned, I'm trying to take a positive spin on this, because as you saw from that sort of exponential growth rate, this stuff's coming for us all, whether we like it or not. And indeed, to avoid global catastrophe, we need to deal. So I'm trying to come to this with, you know, perhaps some slightly innovative and positive responses. And one of the things that I actually will be recommending Australia consider as well is to impose your own carbon border adjustment mechanisms on your own exports. So if you're exporting something to a country or to a region like the European Union, who are planning on putting a tax on an import tax at the border, you can flip that. You can put an export tax on that's equivalent to theirs. Then they have no justification to add their own tax at the border, because that export has already had the carbon tax paid on it as it left your country. The big advantage of that, obviously, you get the revenue, you get the tax revenue, you get control over how the accounting is done, and also how that tax revenue is used. And you may well want to use that revenue to decarbonize your own economy so that you don't get hit by those taxes in future. So one potential option is to flip that story and voluntarily put an export tax on those equivalent for carbon. Another perhaps counterintuitive idea, why not take advantage of the subsidies that the likes of the Chinese and the US are throwing at things like electric vehicles and hydrogen? As far as I'm concerned, that's great. We're all going to get to drive cheaper electric vehicles much sooner than we otherwise would have, thanks to massive Chinese investment in this technology. Same goes for solar panels. In fact, we wouldn't be anywhere near where we are today in terms of having a hope of defeating climate change if it was not for massive subsidies in photovoltaics, first by the Europeans and then by the Chinese. So one approach is to say, well, maybe I'll let them throw lots of subsidies until they get everything really cheap. And then once they've figured out how it all gets done, then I step in. And that's certainly the approach that the Chinese took with the solar panels, right? They let the Europeans do all the hard work with the expensive bit when we were learning how to make solar panels. And then they just came in once the Europeans had figured out how to do it. So think very carefully before you do what the Europeans and Americans are thinking of doing now with Chinese cars and raise barriers to these supposedly cheap goods. If they're green goods, you want them in your economy. You want to be able to decarbonize as fast as possible and as cheaply as possible without raising the costs for your consumers. The last recommendation is something that I've just published a paper on in Energy Research and Social Science, and that is international green economy collaborations. So I mentioned that there's sort of regulatory burden and, for example, misalignment or lack of interoperability in embedded emissions accounting systems could be one of the biggest problems in terms of trade arising from these policies. International green economy collaborations, once again, a great example of what Clive mentioned of possibly the right thing for the wrong reason, tend to be bilateral or small plurilateral. So it's moving away from sort of global system of trade. But that allows them to be much more deep in terms of what they work on. They're also all about mutual gains. So unlike trade agreements, which tend to generate winners and losers, international green economy collaborations, the partner countries only agree on things which have a mutual benefit. For example, information sharing and education. For example, think of these things as enabling international green industrial policy. So where domestic green industrial policy helps to develop new green domestic industries, international green economy collaborations helps to develop new green cross-border supply chains with your trading partners. So in addition to information sharing and education, these involve regulatory collaboration. They'll often involve financing, particularly when there's a north-south partner, market coordination, and regulatory coordination. And when I talk about that regulatory coordination, for example, Australia, in almost all of its such agreements going forward, it is looking to align those embedded emissions accounting schemes. It's looking to align definitions of what is green for green investment technologies. So it's trying to make sure that you don't have these sort of regulatory misalignments causing unnecessary barriers to trade. So I'm not sure how we're going, but I did try to aim to keep it short because I think there's going to be lots of discussion. So I think it's important to remember in conclusion that fossil fuel interests have a strong interest in getting us all to fight over climate policy, right? Because then we give up and we go back to using fossil fuels. So be very careful what you listen to when we're throwing mud at each other's climate policies. That's not to say that there aren't vested interests in other countries who are trying to manipulate climate policies. But it's important to be savvy in your response to these and try to find, as Clive talked about earlier, those win-wins for the environment and for our economies. And I strongly recommend, if your government is not already, looking to participate in green economy collaborations, reach out to your trading partners with whom you want to build green supply chains. And talk to them about developing one of these collaborations to ensure you get the regulatory alignment, you get the research collaboration, and you get the finance flows that you need to support your transition. So thank you very much. I look forward to the rest of the panel and to the discussion. If you'd like to read more about the research in our project, you can either follow that web link at the bottom there, or I learned this at a workshop last week, you can try and photograph that QR code and it should take you to our website. So thank you all very much and talk to you soon.
Thank you very much, Prof. We really appreciate it. I think I did you a disservice because I didn't manage to actually introduce you properly. But I'll take this chance to do it. So as you've seen, Prof is at Australian National University. She's a professor there and also as an associate director for research for the Australian National University Grand Challenge on zero carbon energy for the Asia Pacific. Previous research spans economic globalization, environmental policy, developing countries and the political economy. She's best known for her work on the international investment agreements, where she has influenced both academic debate and policy. On this topic, she's been invited to be an expert at both the OECD and UNCTAD. And she's also an approved supplier of policy advice to developing countries through the UK government's TAP 2+ initiative. But that's just a very abbreviated version of her CV. Please feel free to have a look at it. We've got the link on the website. But thank you very much for opening the discussion for us and really triggering such interesting questions around climate change and trade-related responses to issues of climate change and how that works out. So I've got a couple of questions for you, but we'll come back to you at the end. So the next speaker we'll have is Selta Maimelo. So just a brief bio on Selta's work. So Selta is based in here, obviously here where I am in South Africa, as you'd have seen from the profile, but primarily now working with the trade and industrial policy strategies, which we call TIPS, which I understand is sort of a research think body. Since last year, he is concluding his master's degree in local economic development at the University of Johannesburg and holds a Bachelor of Economics specializing in economic development from the University of the Western Cape. His experience lies in economic research and analysis, policy and planning, and stakeholder engagement. Prior to joining TIPS, Selta worked at the Western Cape government and the One World Sustainable Investment Project. At the Western Cape government, he supported the drafting of the economic recovery plan for the Western Cape province post-COVID-19, as well as drafting the 2020 to 2025 economic strategy plan for the Western Cape government. He was also involved in analyzing the quarterly labor force survey for the Western Cape and reviewing Western Cape municipal plans and strategies. At One World, they supported the delivery of climate change and just transition projects, which obviously makes him quite apt for this particular discussion. So, Selta, you've got 20 minutes. Please go for it.
Thanks, Clive. Let me try to share my screen here. I'm not sure if everyone can see my screen.
Yes, looks good.
Okay, great.
We can see it. We can see it.
Okay, great. So, so my name is Selta Maimelo. I'm an economist here at Trade Industrial Policy Strategies based here in Pretoria, South Africa. So yeah, so I think recently I've been engaged on researching some of the climate change or trade, policies that are being introduced, globally, specifically looking at for example, the European Green Deal through the CBAM as well as the, the IRA in the US. So specifically, since I've been working heavily in the, trying to understand the European Green Deal in general, as well as, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is also a climate, trade policy introduced in the EU. So I've been trying to understand how that will actually impact the African continent, as well as, specifically in South Africa as well. So for this meeting, as Clive said, is a meeting, it's not a webinar or something. So I'm trying to highlight or actually dig, deeper into what Prof have actually just introduced at the high level there. So I had trying to highlight, for example, the CBAM in Africa, how that mechanism introduced in the EU present an economic challenge and, for example, also environmental opportunity for the continent to transition from, some of the fossil fuel-based economies to low carbon economies. So within that context, so my presentation is not going to be that long. I hope it's not going to be that long. So I'm just going to take you through some of the current work that we're actually doing, on the CBAM. So my presentation is going to be quite short. So firstly, I thought that the previous speaker was going to highlight the overview of CBAM, but I think in this case, I'll just, dive deep into that and highlight the overview of what CBAM is and how that will actually impact Africa and how Africa should actually respond to the carbon border adjustment mechanism introduced in the European Union. So in a nutshell, CBAM was introduced actually way back before COVID-19. So I know some of my colleagues at TIPS have actually been doing a lot of work in this space, starting from 2012, 2013 back then, trying to understand the issues of climate change and trade, or how, for example, some of the other anticipated climate change policies will be introduced elsewhere, how that will actually impact trade in some of the, developing countries, specifically looking at South Africa and as well as in Africa. So from some of those engagements, TIPS have actually been keeping tabs of what's actually happening in industries as well as in the global space of what's actually happening in climate change space. So then from there, we've started to realize that, from 2019, the European Union introduced, a package. They call it the Fit for 55 policy package, also known as the European Green Deal. Right, so the Green Deal is a multifaceted green, policy instrument which affects almost everyone, right? Globally, every sector is being included there, is going to be affected. And as part of that package, they have what they call the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is a carbon border tax for hard to abate sectors. So some of the other sectors, as I've just highlighted them in the slide here, it spans across, I think, 6 main sectors, but in the slides here, I've just broken down further so that a lot of people get a nascent understanding of what's actually included under CBAM. Right, so there's sectors such as electricity production, there's cement, there's fertilizers, iron ore, iron and steel, there's hydrogen, there's also aluminium as well. So some of those sectors have been highlighted as priority sectors, right? So based on their carbon intensity and their level of the production, that the carbon intensity that goes into the production of some of those sectors or products, right? So within that context, we also started studying some of these mechanisms, and from here we've seen that the main objectives of CBAM, first of all, is to raise the revenue through the carbon border tax, and of course to also prevent what they call carbon leakage, where we will start to see some entities, globally, let's say, for example, entities in the EU that produce iron and steel or aluminium, they will, with the introduction of CBAM or some carbon border adjustment or some climate change policies, around the world, they will start to locate some of the, locations globally that, for example, don't even have climate change policies in place, and they will start to relocate their production processes there so that they can utilize the leg of climate change policies in some of those locations and start to also identify new market opportunities. But within that context, the CBAM is actually introduced to curtail that anticipated rise of, for example, firms, especially in the identified sectors moving across the world, trying to identify some of the jurisdictions that have lesser climate change policies to utilize the opportunities and continue production, regardless of some of the global catastrophe of climate change that is facing us today. So, and again, with the mechanism, they are also trying to promote climate action abroad. So as much as, the mechanism is specifically focused on the EU, but the main intent and objective of the mechanism is to also promote climate change, across. And as coming back to the title of my slides, is that actually the carbon border adjustment mechanism present environmental opportunities, and with this regard, promoting climate action abroad is actually highlighting of many opportunities in the global south, as well as, for example, in the African continent as well. So that's just briefly what CBAM is. So I know that recently, I think for the past few weeks or so, there has been a lot of engagements where we've started seeing, for example, there was a BRICS summit held in South Africa where some of these issues were actually raised. 2 weeks ago, there was an African climate, summit, so which some of these issues again were raised. Again, this week, there's the WTO public forum, which I think some of these issues have been, extensively raised as well, right? So they have been raised because there's an anticipation, or actually, with the introduction of CBAM. So earlier on, I think in May, later on in July, the CBAM was actually legislated, which actually came into into existence now that some firms, especially operating in some of those sectors, are actually panicking in the space that from the 1st of October this year, CBAM is actually going to start kicking in. Then later on, in 2026, then they will have to start paying what they call the carbon tax, which is introduced under CBAM. Right, so within that context, you start to see that industries all over the world, even governments, are actually panicking, are highlighting some of the other issues that comes with the introduction of CBAM. So there is also a rise of, some of opportunities and some of challenges that are coming up here, and we start to see this coming in, in the WTO Public Forum, even in the Africa Climate Summit. So within that context, we start to see that there are a lot of concerns around the introduction of CBAM. So others, they consider CBAM as climate, a green trade barrier. Others, they say, is a protectionist measures that protects only, for example, firms in the EU, and doesn't even care about other firms, especially in the global south or in developing countries. So there are a lot of concerns, and at the moment, there has been a lot of research done in the space to try to respond to some of these concerns, considering that in few weeks actually now that, the CBAM is going to actually start in terms of, for example, reporting the GHG emissions that goes into the production of some of the other sectors mentioned in the space there. So in the African context, so based on a study that we've actually been doing here at TIPS, we've tried to understand the vulnerability of the introduction of CBAM in the African continent, as well as in Africa, in South Africa as well. But to just give you a high overview of how actually CBAM is going to impact the African continent. So we've seen that there is actually 42 or 44 list of products identified as part of those 6 broad sectors that have been identified as carbon intensive products, and the carbon border adjustment mechanism is actually gonna apply to those sectors. So we've done an extensive analysis in the space, and we've actually highlighted that at least 7.3 billion of African exports are at risk in the short term, as the CBAM is actually coming into fruition starting from October this year, right? And this is about like 3.2% of African exports to the EU, and reflecting 1.1% of total African exports to the world, and highlighting 0.4% of Africa's GDP, right? So there has also been a study as well done by the Africa Climate Foundation and the LSE, so which they focus that if, for example, considering that there's Japan, the UK, the US with the Approved Act now, if they introduce some of these, CBAM-like or carbon border taxes, then Africa will actually, lose 39 billion, yearly, with the introduction of some of these, for example, there's a lot of products that are included now for the 2 as it stands, and there's an anticipation of adding more products in that space. And with the introduction of more products into CBAM, and with other jurisdictions across the world introducing some of these carbon border taxes, then Africa, even if you look at it in the global south, countries, then the introduction of some of these carbon border taxes or green trade policies will actually result in, for example, the loss of GDP in the African continent, and as well as the global south countries. So then this becomes a concern for a lot of people. Governments and industries have highlighted they're actually panicking that with the introduction of these carbon border taxes is not actually favorable, for some of these African countries. And so to just give you an idea of some of the other African countries that will be impacted. And I know that if you've been following some of the developments in the African continent, how CBAM will actually affect the African continent. A lot of people will actually tell you that Mozambique comes, top there, which their GDP as well as their exports will be actually threatened by the introduction of CBAM. And from here, just to give you a selected number of African countries that will be highly impacted, we see Mozambique, of course, that is going to be impacted, looking specifically at the aluminium sector. There's Egypt, there's Morocco, Tunisia, as well as South Africa. So you start to see that the introduction of CBAM is actually, dividing the continent, impacting the global, the northern African countries, as well as some, few, southern African countries, including South Africa, as well as Mozambique, right? So within this context, you start to see that, African countries, especially these ones that are impacted, should actually start acting on, the introduced mechanism, because we already see that there is going to be a lot of countries, globally that introduce some of these carbon border adjustment mechanism as, in retaliation to the EU CBAM, right? So as Prof highlighted, as in her recommendation, that for example, countries globally should actually also start introducing their own, carbon border adjustment mechanism or green trade, policies that will actually promote or protect their industries. Then, there is a need to do that. And with the increased need of introducing some of these, carbon border adjustment mechanisms, then, the African continent, which there are a lot of issues in the continent, will find it battling in terms of trying to access some of those markets in the near future. Right. So just to give you an overview of some of the other issues that came about in the studies that we've been doing, is that for example, looking at CBAM specifically, we start to see that remember, CBAM is going to increase the revenue in the EU. So what basically happens is that if you want to export your products, especially covered in those sectors, you will have to pay a certain levy, a tax to the EU. And in that case, the EU is going to be collecting a lot of money in terms of, for example, exports. And in that space, the money, and there's a lot of debates now that if, for example, the EU collect the money, what will the EU use the money for, right? So the others say that, for example, the money needs to be channeled back into, for example, global South countries, as we've also known that historically they haven't actually contributed a lot to the global crisis of climate change. That's right. So in this context, what we see is that we'll be actually paying the EU's decarbonization journey, with the paying of carbon taxes, in terms of infrastructures in the African continent. So CBAM also requires firms to have, for example, carbon border adjustment mechanisms or, climate change policies in place that, for example, account for the GHG emissions, for example, in terms of production of iron and steel and other goods that are mentioned on the CBAM. So within that context, we start to see that in the African continent, there's actually no infrastructure of such where, for example, GHG emissions are accounted for, which becomes a big issue in terms of implementing, or actually, abiding by the legislation that is introduced in the EU. And of course, the main issue, which I think is being debated heavily now in the WTO public forum, is that the mechanism is a discriminatory measure, which discriminate between domestic and foreign suppliers, right? So there's a discrimination measure that is violated in the WTO there, as well as the climate change issues that comes with that, which we've seen now. I think Clive have already highlighted this in his opening remarks, that there's been an increased shift of climate change responsibility by global North countries, shifting their responsibility to the global South countries. So with the introduction of carbon border taxes such as CBAM, they're introducing some of these measures to actually shift the climate change responsibilities that were previously contributed by these global north countries. So global south countries in this perspective are actually being violated through, violation of the common but differentiated responsibility that is being highlighted in the UNFCCC. So that's an issue. So another issue, that comes with the introduction of CBAM as well is that there is, we anticipate that of the African continent with its, less climate change policies or ambitious climate change policies is going to be a playground. So as I've highlighted earlier on in the slides, that the main objective of CBAM actually is to also prevent what they call carbon leakage. So in this case, we will start to see that the African continent will be a playground for carbon leakage because, there's a lot of issues in the continent. And there has also been a lot of pushback saying that, we have, previously or historically, we haven't contributed a lot to global climate change, the GHG emissions. So within that case, but we know that the African continent is heavily impacted by climate change. So within that, respect is that carbon leakage is going to actually be one of the other issues that prevail in the continent with the results of introducing some of these measures, across the world. So just my last slide, which focuses on some of the other immediate, recommendations or how Africa should respond to CBAM and other green trade policies introduced elsewhere. So what we've seen is that recently in the public forum, the WTO public forum, some of these engagements have actually been focusing more on the global south countries and specifically looking at the African continent on how it's going to be impacted and how, for example, Africa should respond to some of these climate change and trade policies that are introduced elsewhere, right? So as a start, the African continent can, establish what they call the regional carbon market, and with that will come with the regional carbon pricing, because we know that in the African continent, looking specifically in terms of carbon pricing, there's only one country that has carbon price in place, which is South Africa, right? But with the introduction of, for example, a regional carbon price, there is an opportunity that is presented there that, if you have a carbon price in place under CBAM, then you will have to just prove that, for example, you've paid the tax, domestically, then there's no need for you to pay into the EU. And with that, comes an opportunity of retaining some of the revenue that we said that, it's going to go into the EU coffers and later on decarbonize the EU journey. Then that amount, or revenue can be used locally to decarbonize or fund climate action, in the continent. So those are some of the opportunities that comes with the establishment of regional carbon price. And of course, the regional carbon market, there's, as we know that the African continent, there's a lot of natural resources that are still untapped, and there's a lot of carbon sinks in the continent that still need to be utilized, especially in terms of selling carbon credits, right? So there is a lot of opportunities, and me being following some of these engagements for the past 3 weeks, there has been a lot of, an emphasis on the creation of a carbon market in the African continent. So within that context, there's a need for the continent to proactively respond to some of these, green trade policies introduced elsewhere by introducing their own, carbon market, right? So, and of course, there's a need for capacity building and technical assistance in that space as well. For example, with the introduction of CBAM, we know that there's a lot of technicalities that comes with the introduction of the CBAM, for example, in terms of going into accounting for GHG emissions, because there's a lot of technicalities that are required for accounting for that. And later on, verifying that, for example, the GHG emissions that we emitted in the space were actually, corresponding to that. So yeah, and again, there is an, ministerial conference happening in February next year. So, and also there's MC14 ministerial conference that is going to happen in Cameroon in 2025 through the WTO. So as the WTO is a multilateral policy institute, then we can utilize that to raise some of our issues. And I'm just happy that in the public forum now, there has been a lot of issues, especially pertaining to the African continent, being raised in that forum. Then we're just hoping that in the next 2 ministerial conferences, then we can, cement some of our concerns, and possibly, the global north can actually hear our concerns and our cries in the space in terms of some of these introduced climate change policies. And of course, in the long term, there is a need for, other issues. And I think maybe my time is up here, just to just to wrap it up.
Maybe we could just wrap it up.
Yeah. So just to wrap it up, again, in terms of being proactive, the African continent, we know that the industrial policy, for example, looking at the African Free Continental Trade Area, right? So the AFTA doesn't actually have a green component in that regard. So, going forward, I think we need to advocate for an inclusion of a green aspect into the trade agreement, right? So, and within that, there is a need for creating a climate resilient developmental regionalism. I'm not gonna dive deep into that. And there's also need for debt for climate swaps. So we know that the African continent has a lot of debt that is unsustainable. And considering our resources in the climate change area, then we can utilize some of those to, for example, trade swap the climate, the debt for climate investment in the continent, which can help in terms of climate action, across the continent. And of course, the last recommendation that I have here is to support the reform of the multilateral system in its entirety. So the WTO needs to be, reformed. The global financial system also needs to be reformed. And with the, the introduction of some of these green trade policies introduced globally, it opens a window for the African continent and global south, countries to actually collaborate in the space to reform some of these multilateral systems, so that they actually promote fair and just systems in the global south countries. So yeah, that's just, I know that I went over time and I apologize for that, but yeah, so this is just my presentation, and thanks for allowing me to just go a little bit more.
Thank you very much. Quite passionate and a very erudite perspective from the global, from the African perspective. So we really appreciate it for you. We appreciate that you gave us the perspective, at least from a CBAM perspective, and how Africa and South Africa at least is supposed to respond to that. So we'll engage a little bit more with those issues. In terms of time, so I'm going to quickly move on to Dr. Simo. I'll give you a brief bio and then let him take the floor. So Dr. Simo is a lecturer, research and education at the School of Law, specializing in international world trade law at Queen's University, Belfast. His research focuses on international law, international economic law and development, and African Union economic law issues. In September 2022, he was appointed as a UK Trade and Sustainable Development Domestic Advisory Group. He's also before joining Queen's University Belfast, he was a senior researcher at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. Before that, he was the teaching and research fellow at Bocconi University in Milan, Italy, and the Marie Curie fellow at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. He has held visiting lecture positions at the European University Institute, Florence in Italy, and the University of Pretoria in South Africa, and he has been a visiting researcher position at the Swiss Institute of Comparative Law. And lastly, he holds a PhD in international law and economics from Bocconi University and LM from the University of Freiburg in Switzerland, specializing in international trade law, and an MSc in comparative law, economics and finance from Turin, Italy, and an LLB from the University of Buea in Cameroon. Dr. Simo, please take the floor. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you, Clive. Well, it's always difficult to come after two speakers have already spoken about the CBAMs and all these green protectionist measures. So my task, as you've highlighted, is to discuss what is my research is in the field of international trade. So I would take the floor to discuss the international trade law aspects of these measures, basically. in order to do that, I will first start by at least giving a few words about what we mean by green protectionism and in trade specifically. And of course, discuss the rise of climate change policies in the context of geopolitical tensions, especially those measures that we have that have been highlighted by the previous panelists. And of course, what are developing countries' perspectives again, concerning the trade aspect and also the protectionist aspect of the measures. And then I will conclude whether and maybe give an answer or not to the questions which has been asked, whether these climate change legislations are against international trade or against sustainable development. So what do we mean by green protectionism? Well, these are the use of measures. Measures are laws or regulations for protectionist ends under the guise of addressing legitimate environmental policies. Well, basically, it means that countries, when you speak about green protectionism in trade, we are talking about countries using environmental policies to protect their domestic industry. Mainly because they want to, or at least they are portray these measures as beneficial for the environment. They might be beneficial for the environment, but in the end result is that the measures actually end up being protectionist in disguise. So we all know that in the field of international trade, protectionism is not always seen as a good thing. But if good for whom? Again, this is the question which we tend to want to address, and we see environmental policy as something which is good, right? Something which is good, and this is why many countries justify their green protectionism or their measures aimed at protection to protect the environment as beneficial for the environment. But is it always the case? Which is why we are here to discuss some of these measures. So I said that these measures are now being advanced, or at least being introduced in the context that we all know. We know that the COVID-19 has come and passed, or maybe still is coming back again, we don't know. We know that in the course of economic recovery, post-COVID economic recovery, WTO members or countries in the world starting introducing measures that will not necessarily get them out of or to alleviate the economic downturn that they suffered during COVID-19. And apart from that, from the post-COVID recovery mechanism, we have trade wars that have emerged in the meantime. We also have WTO in crisis, many challenges of concluding WTO negotiations, meaning that that has actually led countries to resort to unilateral actions. So it's in the context of this, and of course, we have a recent Ukraine and Russia war that has also resulted in countries not always aligning their foreign trade policies with the sanctions that we've all encountered, we all seen. So it's in the context of this that countries have enacted these legislations. Well, I will not say the first, because again, the European Green Deal somehow precedes the United States Inflation Reduction Act. We knew that European emission trading system existed before. But in the context of geopolitical tensions, I want to highlight what the US did in 2022 by introducing the Inflation Reduction Act, which actually contains a battery of measures. The important one, or at least the relevant one for me for international trade, being the green subsidies. Well, these are subsidies that are being granted, conditioned upon local content requirement, asking producers to benefit from tax holidays or tax credit if they actually use certain materials for the manufacturing of, I would say, green products such as electric vehicle or electric car. So these are subsidies which are contingent upon certain action by the producers. These measures, of course, can potentially be WTO incompatible in the sense that they actually go against the rules, WTO rules on subsidies. And also, because they also go against WTO rules on discrimination, they are potentially challengeable at the WTO in that regard. So this is what the US did first in 2022. Now, we all know that these measures affected all the developing countries' manufacturing industry. So potentially can drive producers from these countries toward the United States because they will benefit from certain tax credits. In order to counter this avenue, or somehow the carrot which the US is actually trying to give to producers, the US contracted recently with the Net Zero Industry Act, also with the same purpose of kind of accelerating the US climate neutrality commitments and also its clean energy transition. But again, like I said, in the context of geopolitical tension, the main intention behind the EU Net Zero Industry Act, which is very rushed, it was not really discussed. It didn't go through the usual adoption and discussion processes. It was very rushed. It's basically to prevent EU's company from relocating in the United States to benefit from the IRA. And now we have the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which has been adopted and which is entering into force in a couple of weeks from now. And also other countries have their own, even the United States has its own carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is yet to be adopted by Congress, which is being discussed. So these are measures adopted by developed countries for now, mainly from my perspective of analysis, which actually is being taken in the context of geopolitical tensions, where every country is trying to strive for its own benefit, disregarding the commitments, most of which is in the, disregarding the commitment they made, for instance, to pursue all these reforms in the multilateral setting. So, what are CBAMs about? Well, the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, they aim at subjecting products which are imported in the EU customs territory to carbon pricing equivalent to that which is applied to the European manufacturers of the same product. And as we all know, they say the primary objective is to fight against carbon leakages. So how does it function? Actually, CBAMs tackle the origin of the goods, mainly imported products, and the means how they are manufactured. They only tackle the end product, but they tackle the processes, the method of manufacturing. Because if you are emitting, you have to show that your products meet a certain carbon footprint. So this is important to benefit from or to be excluded from these adjustment taxes at the border. So from that perspective, they tackle not only the origin of the good, but also the production methods. So these are international trade aspect of it. So let's say they do it in the name of the environment. Well, it's possible that they do it in the name of environment. Why? Because again, they say the US, the EU say that the carbon border adjustment mechanism is there to enforce, or at least to implement the Paris Agreement on climate change, which aim at reducing thank you, Clive, which aim at reducing the global temperature to a certain level. So this is the reason behind carbon border adjustment mechanism. So basically, they may be implemented in the name of the environment. Well, is it always the case? Well, not so sure, because again, like I said earlier, the Paris Agreement does not prescribe a uniform approach towards achieving this temperature target. Rather, it says that countries should do so. They should contribute. Each country has its own national targets. Then they should do so by taking into account their national circumstances. Yet, carbon budget adjustment mechanisms do not always take into account every other country's target, even though because they are trying to shift the burden towards this country by harmonizing, so to speak, the ways in which certain products should be manufactured without taking into account these national circumstances. So this is why these are, from my perspective, these are industrial policies aimed at protecting certain domestic production, and they are protectionism in disguise. So are there recourse avenues? Well, like I said, the CBAMs apply exclusively to imported goods, and they potentially violate the most favored nation principle in the sense that they may apply to imported goods. They might discriminate between two imported goods, or they might discriminate between imported and domestic-like products. So this is why they might potentially violate national treatment also. But of course, we know that legitimate sustainable development objectives and legitimate unilateral actions at the WHO are do not always violate this principle if they can be justified as an exception. So, of course, provided that they meet the requirement to pass the test of the Article 20, for instance, of the GATT when it comes to goods. So now, like I said, when the elephant fights, it is the grass that suffer. What about developing countries? Developing countries' perspectives to CBAMs are, of course, as you would suspect, they oppose, they challenge all these mechanisms for a number of reasons. The first one is that the CBAMs go against the common but differentiated responsibility, which, as we know, kind of say that while we are all responsible to address common environmental challenges, we should assume differentiated responsibility in the responses. We should not fully embrace, we should not tackle, we didn't contribute the same level as you guys did, so we shouldn't be held responsible for the whole, for the relief mechanism. But CBAMs do ignore this. They don't differentiate between targeted country, even though I think the proposal initially was to include different special and differential treatment, but it didn't happen. The end product did not include that. So the CBAMs do not. They go against common but differentiated responsibility, which is dear to environmental law principle. So they say these CBAMs are in the pursuit of environmental goods, but yet they don't embrace some of these principles, which is somehow contradictory. They also disregard WHO special and differential treatment principle. Again, some of these members, the EU is the WHO member, the United States the WHO member, yet the CBAMs normally should have included all of these. We see why it's relevant to have it at the WHO table, but they disregard the special and differential treatment principle in the sense that when you look at the preamble of the WHO agreement, it says that, and this is the first recital of the preamble of the WHO agreement, that say that seeking both to protect and preserve the environment and embrace the means of doing so in a manner consistent with respective needs and concerns at different levels of economic development. Meaning that each time that WHO members are to impose such certain measures, they always have to take into account the respective level of development of countries to which the measure will apply. And the special and differential treatment provisions in WHO were actually devised to actually address some of these issues, such as flexibility in commitment. Well, since I have a few minutes left, what is the principal challenge that developing countries actually are saying? What are they saying against the CBAM specifically? They're saying that, well, the unilateral preferences or unilateral measures should not take precedence over multilaterally agreed solutions, which are the WHO table. Again, they're saying that the Committee on Trade and Environment, which is the forum where the environmental issues are discussed at the WTO should not be sidelined in favor of unilateral actions. And we know the context of this is known. This is the first report of the Committee on Trade and Environment, which was issued in 1996, which actually provides for the fact that countries should not introduce WTO inconsistent or protectionist trade restriction measures in an attempt to offset any real or perceived adverse domestic economic competitiveness. Again, it's saying that if the EU or the US wants to apply carbon adjustment or carbon taxes domestically, they should not force all the WTO members to do the same. Because again, they should not increase the standard by which everybody should abide. If they want to have the certain standard domestically, this should not be done at the cost of multilateral solutions. The report further goes on to say that members have endorsed the Rio Declaration principles, including particularly Principle 12. Principle 12 actually of the Rio Declaration says that unilateral actions should not be taken. The unilateral actions by members to address environmental concern should be avoided, and rather should go through consensus. So the Rio Declaration exhorts countries to avoid unilateral actions and recommend environmental measures which address transboundary or global problems to be based on consensus. In a word, simply saying that WTO is the forum where some of these issues should be discussed and adopted. Because again, this is where members agree by consensus to move forward. Of course, the WTO countries are not against addressing climate change. Of course, many of them already take measures to address some of these issues, such as plastic bag bans. They simply say that the measures which are being taken outside WTO forum should not bind them. Again, because the WTO agreement have mechanism in place to challenge, to make this measure conform or compatible with WTO provisions, such as Article 20 that I just highlighted earlier on, such as where you can use to somehow you can use Article 20 to justify any inconsistent climate change policy or legislation. So the conclusion, I know I'm running out of time, the conclusion, like I said, are these measures against trade or sustainable development. I say both, because again, these are industrial policies, which goes against the international trade mechanism, because again, international trade says you should liberalize. But here we are talking about protectionism. Industrial policy, basically, the policies whereby the members, WTO members, are no longer abiding, not always, by WTO rules, simply put, because they want to nurture national champions in certain areas. So again, because at the end of the day, these mechanisms are being imposed extraterritorially to other WTO members without going through the normal adoption processes. Like I said, they potentially violate non-discrimination and do not consider differentiation in their design and application, in total disregard of international law. International law, not only in the international trade law, special treatment, but also international environmental law, the common but differential responsibility. So, do we have the possibility to respond in the African context? This is the question which we might have to reflect on in the Q&A session. But for now, like Sultan just said, there is no continental-wide carbon market in that regard, and the AFCFTA does not at the moment have in place possibility to, of course, there are industrial action, the industrial policies mechanism in the AFCFTA text. Of course, there are also exceptions that can be used, such as the one in the WTO, but currently, there is no continental response yet to this kind of measures which have been imposed on goods coming out of Africa, such as the one that Sultan just mentioned, Mozambique in the aluminum sector, which is bound to be suffer the most from these European carbon border adjustment, because again, the majority of the exports of Mozambican aluminum goes to the European market. So this is why it stands to suffer the most from this mechanism. So I thank you for your attention, and looking forward to discussing with you.
No, thank you very much. As you can see, it's been quite a passionate discussion. So I only left about 7 minutes to engage. So I'll ask that you keep our responses very direct. There's already a question from Dina, from Prof. Emma, and Sawitam. There's also a question for you. Maybe I'll just read out the question if you've not seen it. But the question is to Prof. Emma. Your recommendations seem to be aimed at country level, but Sawitam is pointing for the need for regional level responses. How can these suggestions be leveled up at regional level? What are the risks and problems with regional responses? And then for Sawitam, how likely is a TAMIA's AU level response, and what are the barriers there? Prof, you can start.
Yeah, thanks, Dina and Clive, and thanks to my fellow panelists. Excellent and thought-provoking, and a wide range of views, as hoped, I'm sure. I think one of the key things that we're seeing across the spectrum here is almost, I was the unilateralist, and Swami was the sort of regionalist, and Regis was the multilateralist. I thought that was a really nice contrast. Multilateralism is fantastic when it works. It's obviously the first best. The concern I have of someone who works in climate policy is that it moves too slowly. And the economic, not to mention every other sort of cost of continued inaction or too slow action on climate change is going to be way, way more than the economic cost of giving up a little bit of multilateralism. And I think this applies also to the regional example. So if Africa can get itself together as a region and agree to a carbon pricing scheme as suggested, fantastic. That's obviously better than unilateral approaches. But if that's all too hard, like, we don't have 10 years to get that sorted. Or while you're getting that sorted over the next 10 years, you might also think, in the meantime, I'm going to do this unilateral action because I can actually make it happen next year. So I'll let my fellow panelists respond.
Yeah, so with regards to my question, so at the moment the EU hasn't there's no continental response to CBAM, right? So we've seen across the world, for example, BRICS countries have been pushing and saying that CBAM is not a good mechanism because it's not it's going to be harmful to industries. For example, in India, we started to see India engaging with the EU now on a bilateral level on the measure. But in the African continent, there isn't yet a continental response. So I'm hoping that, obviously considering, summit now at the WTO, Africa being at the center stage as well. So I think that, the international responses, especially happening now, with Africa not having that response yet, I think it's going to force them to actually try to respond to CBAM, right? So, and of course, I think, research think tanks such as, TIPS have been heavily engaged in, publishing some of the work to push, for example, some of these African countries or even South Africa as well, to engage in terms of, responding to some of these green trade, policies introduced everywhere. So I'm just hoping as well that, there will be a continental response soon, right? Hopefully before the WTO ministerial conference 14 in 2025. Because now there's already a lot of engagements happening and negotiations, especially with regards to the AFTA already. There has been some protocols that have been, negotiated there. And we're hoping that, possibly the sustainable development, for example, protocol can be developed, or even environmental, protocol can be developed, and later on be negotiated. Because, as we know that the AFTA is still, in the process of being fully implemented, as much as it has already started in 2021, there is a lot of climate change stuff that needs to be, included in that space there. So yeah, I think this is just my view. I'm sure Regis has something to, add on that.
I've got a question, maybe just in closing, maybe for Regis and Prof. Emma. Is this the kind of race to the bottom that we want, in terms of the national responses? Dr. Simo, do you want to start? Briefly, we've got maybe like a couple of minutes left.
Well, the thing is, like I said earlier, developing countries or African countries are not actually against climate change policies. I think they oppose them from a political perspective at the WTO. Basically, what they're actually doing is simply using a bargaining chip, I would say. Because like you observe that many of them actually tackle environmental change in their domestically. They simply don't want some of these, I would say, unilateral actions that go extraterritorial and apply to them without their consent. Because again, at the WTO, they still consider that the round is not concluded. And they still have some certain issues that have not been addressed. So they don't want to have some of these issues tackled by the Committee of Trade and Environment. Again, they oppose some of these issues that are already in a, for instance, the plastic initiative, for instance, they oppose that at the Committee on Trade and Environment, yet they ban plastic bags domestically. So usually they use it only for the political, bargaining chip, I would say. And of course, many of these measures can also really harm their industrial development, and they would certainly need to address them on a more concerted manner rather than piecemeal. I mean, concerted mean in the context of African continent.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
If I'm allowed one more very short comment, just to say that Europe, they don't have much land or much sunshine. They can't get cheap renewable energy, unlike Africa. So I would say it's not necessarily counter to your industrial development if you leapfrog and go to renewables as fast as you can. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Yeah, there's so much we could discuss. Yeah. No, go ahead, Dina.
Thank you, Clive. I just note we're at time. I am sitting in an increasingly hot and sunny Europe, so we'll see where we are in a few years' time. But this has been an incredibly fascinating panel. I think what this panel has done that I think is really hard to do is simultaneously bring the context of trade, protectionism, and explain some of the new laws that are emerging in a way that makes it incredibly accessible to an audience that includes me, that has very little kind of experience or understanding of international trade dynamics, while also taking us immediately into the complexity and the nuance and the debate, and providing, as Emma said, 3 very different perspectives on it. So well done to all of you. Thank you to all of you. Well done to Clive for putting together such a fantastic panel. It's been fascinating, and I'm really glad it's been part of the summer school. Don't go far away. We have an exciting full day of talks and panels and discussions, except maybe for those of you who are in Australia, need to go to bed. In half an hour, we're going to have a panel on the European Union's sustainable blue economy. So we're not moving far away from this topic. We're looking at the way in which the EU has responded to the ocean. So please come back for that. This recording is going to be on our YouTube channel, so come back and watch it again and again. And thank you again to our panelists, and thank you again to Clive for putting this panel together. See you all shortly.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Cheers.